Volley Fire! A game I've seen on numerous Game Boy multi-carts, no doubt because of its small size. It's a game that, when I recorded it, honestly, after about the first 2 minutes of the first level, I was pretty sure I'd seen basically everything this game had to offer, and in a way, I was right. But, for the sake of professionalism, I continued to play this for an hour. And I gotta say, I'm glad I did, because it does show a lot more about itself as you go on. It's still very much the same game, and it's not the most exciting game ever, but it's better than it initially presents itself to be. Volley Fire is sort of your standard sort of shooting game. Your goal is to unify the space government by going to planets, fighting all resistance, and turning them into knockoff McDonald's with upside-down arches. That is the plot in its entirety, as far as I can tell. But what's interesting is the way it takes place. It reminds me a lot of an old game whose name I can't remember on the Atari 2600 that featured gunslingers shooting between wagons trying to kill each other. This is very much the same. You take your little spaceship at the bottom of the screen and you try and shoot the spaceship at the top of the screen. The frustrating thing being that the spaceship you're fighting moves entirely randomly. It doesn't actually try and actively go after you. I've tested this. You have numerous objects in the center of the environment that are constantly moving, getting in the way of your shots, thus kind of making it more frustrating than it needs to be. Now, the funny thing is, like I said at the beginning, this is how it initially presents itself to be, and while there's certainly a lot of it in this is the worst part about this game, because as you progress through the levels and go further and further, the environments and the obstacles, and indeed your opponents, actually change up fairly regularly. Instead of just moving objects in the center, well, now you've got objects that you can move by shooting, and if you shoot them into the path of your opponent, well, suddenly you cut them off, limiting how far they can move to shoot them. There's bits of environment you can shoot to destroy, giving you temporary shielding, which means that you could strategically, in quotes strategically, again, the enemy moves kind of randomly, so there's no real strategy to it, but you can hide behind some of that stuff for temporary cover and shoot at your opponent on the rebound. Not bad. You could run into an environment that actually behaves sort of like a proper vertical scrolling shooter with all of the environment around you moving and you can't touch the walls. That was actually really genuinely cool, up until I ran into one of the biggest issues with this game, which is your opponent doesn't have to follow the same rules you do. They can fly through the walls just fine. In fact, on the horizontal axis of movement that you have, the enemy can actually move further to the left and right than you can, allowing him to dodge your shots while you might not necessarily be able to dodge theirs, if they were in the same position you were. It's not exactly great now, is it? But what is interesting is how it does evolve, because eventually you stop shooting at this one ship, then suddenly you're fighting a giant ship with giant cannons on it. Or you have to fight a mech. And the neat thing about this is it grows and evolves because eventually it starts combining objects. You know, suddenly you're fighting a mech and your opponent's ship in moving asteroids. Or suddenly you have to fight all these things, but you're in the vertical scrolling segment. It's really interesting to see. And then eventually, once you conquer your opponents, you turn the planet into its knockoff McDonald's, selling even worse knockoff hamburgers than the actual McDonald's, and that's a scary thought. And then you move on to the next one. What is interesting about this, however, is you can actually select where you go on this map, allowing you to sort of carve your own progression path through the game. And I think that is really impressive. I like that a lot. But at the time of recording, we are at like 4.5 minutes in. I'm betting it's going to be about at least like 3.5 minutes. But I've basically talked about everything about the gameplay. It's very simple. The enemies don't really follow the same rules you do, and really it all comes down to taking pot shots at your opponent, hoping you wing them on the sides so that you can end up not getting destroyed yourself. It's really bizarre to see that shots cancel each other out, and even though there are power-ups, which you get by shooting weird space squid things, they don't seem to really do all that much. Sure, you can get a laser that's slightly bigger, but it still gets erased by your opponent's single shots, thus making it pointless. In fact, it's kind of a downgrade because beforehand, you could sort of shoot slightly off center, winging your opponent, just missing their shot while you dodge theirs. With a bigger shot, well, that doesn't work because it's got a bigger hitbox, and boom, it's erased. The power-ups in this game don't make a lot of sense, and there's very little strategy, and your opponents are completely nonsensical and unthinking random targets. Going back to what I said at the beginning, you know, playing this game for 2 minutes in the first moments of this game, you know, you get the entire experience of it. Yes, it changes, it evolves, and it's really interesting to see what it does, but it's a very, very shallow experience that never improves. it just changes a little bit. And while I think it's great that it does at least try and create more content than simply the first level that, honestly, when I started, I assumed was literally the entire game, it really isn't much more than literally the entire game when you get to the end of it. And that's really sad. The overall presentation to Volley Fire is pretty fantastic. Now, don't get me wrong, when you're actually shooting your opponents, the visuals are not that great, but the side shots from your ship are pretty fantastic. Some of the enemies, like the mechs and the giant ship you fight, pretty nice. The details on the planet that you're converting into really bad burger chains, great. And the soundtrack to this game is way better than this game deserves. It is ridiculous how good and how really intense the soundtrack to this game is. It's catchy, it's high-paced, it's actiony, it is fantastic. Why is it in this game that is, at best, a game you'll probably play for a few minutes and then never touch again? It makes no sense. Seriously, if you're gonna play this game, play for the soundtrack because it's awesome. That's the high point. Now, if you want a copy of Volley Fire, the cheapest one I'm seeing right now is $8 plus shipping. And that seems like a bit much. This game does appear to be a Japanese exclusive game. It never got ported out of Japan, and I can kind of see why. I can't see it setting the world on fire. And for $8 plus shipping, that does just seem like a lot, especially when we live in a world where importing Game Boy games from Japan can cost $1 or less. This is honestly not that great a game. It's interesting to see that it does a lot more than it initially shows you, and it does get a little bit better in terms of gameplay, but it's still a ridiculously shallow experience with power-ups that are basically worthless, enemies that are mindless, and ultimately gameplay that is at best interesting to see progress, but boring, or just flat out bad and random. Because this Volley Fire is genuinely not that particularly interesting a game. It's a game that you might want to try for a few seconds, you might want to try to listen to the soundtrack, and you absolutely should, because again, the soundtrack is by far the high point on this game. But Volley Fire itself is not going to set the world on fire. Instead, I'm pretty sure it got extinguished at the title screen.